preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Laura Kaminsky. As Associate Education Director for the Humanities at the 92nd Street Y, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Y this evening and to the final night of our film series, Critic's Choice. In each evening of this series, you have had the opportunity to view a film chosen by a major critic, which had either failed to achieve the prominence which the critic felt it deserved, or which had faded into an undeserved obscurity over the years. Following its screening, you are given a chance to view the film through the critic's eyes. Thus far, Judith Christ introduced us to the intense personal drama of Heart Like a Wheel. Dan Isaac shared the politically charged film Medium Cool, and last week, Stuart Klein brought us John Garfield in Robert Rosson's powerful film Body and Soul. This week, our guest is Richard Schickel. The film which Mr. Schickel has chosen is Out of the Past. I will let him tell you about the film. I would like, however, to take a moment to introduce him. Richard Schickel is a man of enormous accomplishments. He has made a name for himself in 3 careers. He has been a film critic for Time since 1973, having previously served life in the same capacity. He is also the author of many books, including the definitive biography D.W. Griffith, An American Life, the Disney version, his picture in the papers, and a well-received novel, Another I, Another You. Most recently, he published Cary Grant, A Celebration, and has just completed a study of the celebrity system and its effect on American life. Finally, for the last decade, Mr. Schickel has been a producer, writer, and frequently director of many television specials. Among them are the acclaimed PBS series The Men Who Made the Movies, Life Goes to the Movies, Into the Morning, Willa Cather's America, and most recently a film biography of James Cagney and a history of the Star Wars saga. Given the enormous range of his accomplishments, it is indeed an honor to have Mr. Schickel here with us this evening for the screening of Out of the Past. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Schickel.
Well, first of all, it's good to see so many people with a sense of priorities. I guess just on a more solemn note, because I think anybody who is out here tonight is someone who obviously cares about film. And I think probably we're all shocked and dismayed at the news of Francois Truffaut's death. And to some degree, since his last film was a tribute to the kind of film we're going to see tonight, I feel appropriate to mention my own sadness, and I'm sure your sadness, at his passing. Out of the Past, made in 1947, is, to my mind, and I think increasingly to the minds of a lot of people who care about films of that era, perhaps the best of the breed of that genre we've come to call film noir. I chose it in large measure because I just plain like it. I enjoy seeing it. I've seen it several times. I find it to be a rich film and a highly entertaining film, and one that I don't want to make any vast claims for intellectually or artistically, but I will make a claim for as within its range and within a style of filmmaking that for perhaps a decade or so was the American style of quote-unquote serious or melodramatic movies. As probably many of you know, the film was directed by James Tourneur and based on a script by a writer who was billed on the screen as Jeffrey Holmes, but who was in fact a man named Daniel Mainwaring. And I think there's an interesting coincidence in those two talents coming together to make this film. Because it seems to me that film noir in general was a product of two kinds of sensibilities coming together in Hollywood at that time, and really disparate sensibilities of quite different backgrounds, coming together and by fusing their peculiar strengths, giving this genre its strength. Perhaps a good idea is to mention just historically some of the films that immediately preceded this kind of filmmaking. Films that I suppose are also, like Out of the Past, classics of the genre. Most critics, I suppose, date noir as a conscious genre, though a lot of its stylistic tendencies were seen earlier, from John Huston's Maltese Falcon, made just prior to the war. But during the war, at fairly regular intervals, we saw things that we would include as mainstream films noir. I mean, such pictures as Glass Key, Double Indemnity. Right after that, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Kiss of Death around the same time as this, White Heat, maybe Murder, My Sweet, also emanating from RKO, as this picture does, a couple of years ahead of it. What was brought together in this type of film, as I said, were two sensibilities. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, is a stylistic sensibility on the part of directors. I think what had happened was that increasingly in the 1930s, as European directors fled from Europe, from the tyranny that either had arrived in their country or they saw was about to arrive, came to Hollywood, and as a result brought with them a European style of filmmaking. It's marked, I think, particularly by a much more fluid kind of a camera than we see in the typical Hollywood film of the 1930s. Certainly much deeper contrasts of shadow and light, often fog, often rain-wet streets, often neon signs blinking on and off. A lot of stuff that had appeared in one way or another in European films dating back really to the silent era, but which had not been particularly prevalent in American films up until that time. American films had tended to be shot sort of waist high with a lot of cutting, not so much mobility of camera, and also in a much sunnier sort of an atmosphere than this European tradition had offered. So they were there and ready to use that particular talent, and in many respects, the war years suited them because so many Hollywood films had to do with European settings of one sort or another, spy pictures, pictures about the resistance, that kind of thing. And that kind of film and filmmaking had offered these people numerous opportunities in Hollywood. The second thing that had happened was that that group of writers that I think generically were referred to by Edmund Wilson as the boys in the back room, people like James Cain, Horace McCoy, the more famous, to us, more famous names like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, had come to prominence in the literary community, and then subsequently, for most of them, had come to Hollywood, where they were working as screenwriters. They had most of them done, in some cases, obviously crime stories. In other cases, stories that had to do with sort of the underside of American life, people living rather marginal existences, working at rather marginal tasks. Not necessarily criminals, but on the criminal fringe of things, as the characters in certainly Postman Always Rings Twice were, certainly as the characters of Double Indemnity were. Now you have these two sort of, to me, or obviously it seems, antithetical figures. European directors coming out of an art tradition, And these sort of American writers, most of whom had cut their teeth on pulp magazine writing, which is for younger people a kind of fiction that no longer exists, but really were printed on pulpy paper and cost a dime or a nickel or a quarter at the most, and which featured mystery and action and western and aviation stories, mainly for men, almost exclusively for men. The best of those people had, of course, moved on beyond that kind of penny-a-word writing into this crime and quasi-crime writing, and they were natural talents for Hollywood. I mean, the kind of melodrama that Hollywood liked to make were often adapted from their very stories or from their novels, and many of them stayed on in Hollywood and, of course, made their livings as screenwriters. Such a man was, in fact, Daniel Mainwaring, who wrote this script based on his own novel called Build My Gallows High. You'll hear that referred to in the dialogue in the picture. Mainwaring's major credit that I think everybody here would recognize would be the first and obviously the best version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which he had adapted from another writer about his standing in the literary community. Anyway, he had a rather long and rather undistinguished career in movies. But in this picture, I think you will find that the qualities that are salient at the best of that kind of writing, a kind of tough, poetic realism, he manages extremely well. In fact, one of the reasons I chose this picture is because I just like the writing of it very much. I mean, it's only superficially realistic. It's a kind of pushed and romantic realism, which I think works very well for its subject matter. And it's one of the things that you will have noticed if you saw the recent remake of this picture, which was called Against All Odds and came out last spring. It misses just vividly. I mean, it has no writing of the caliber that you will find, I hope, and think in this movie. The director of the picture, James Tourneur, was in fact born in France, but he had come to Hollywood at a very early age because his father was an enormously distinguished, for a time, silent picture director. In fact, in the early 1920s, his father was ranked by many critics as every bit the equal of D.W. Griffith, and in many ways perhaps his superior as a poetic realist. He did not necessarily do crime pictures in those days, the elder Tourneur, but he did work in a manner that is European, in which obviously he passed on down to his son. And as a footnote, it might be noted that when he left Hollywood and returned to France, Maurice Tourneur passed the last years of his life translating American mystery stories into French. His son Jacques was a film cutter, and in fact been a film cutter for his father before turning to directing, and I think made his first name as a director working in Val Lewton's unit, also at RKO, which was the unit responsible for many low-budget and extremely good horror films of the 40s. It was a unique unit in that those horror pictures were all based on kind of psychological horror, psychological terrors would be the better word for it. And his previous credit to this, which I'm sure you all know, and which I'm sure you all love, is Cat People. The original version, needless to say, the good version. In any event, we have coming together here under the aegis of RKO, not at that time a very prosperous studio. In fact, it's hard to know at a time when RKO was a prosperous studio. But they were one of the specialists in film noir. I would venture to say, in fact, that for this period, from roughly 1943 until about 48 or 49, they made more of them, and they made more of them that are kind of memorable than any other studio. For some reason, the studio style, which again depended on this lovely shadowy look of the films, the love of night shooting and all of that, it was very much a studio style at RKO. It suited their craftsmen, it suited their cameramen in particular, and they were very lucky also to have under contract at that time the star of this picture, who was Robert Mitchum. I don't think there's a better noir figure than Mitchum. one of the characteristics of his acting, if it's part of his acting, was his clothes always looked like they were 2 sizes too big. And for some reason, that had a romantic aura about them. I think you'll see that in this picture. There's something wonderful in the way he looks. Hard for me to describe, not being an expert in American costume. But there is something in his manner as well as in his wardrobe that suggests a man with an unhappy past and a man who will, as you will see, begin to accept a rather gloomy fate in this picture, but still with a quip or two on his lips. The mystery to me about film noir and its prominence at this particular historical moment lies in this, and that is the representation of female figures in the films. I know of no time in American film history where so many women were so bad, and where so many men were led virtually unprotesting, virtually without knowing what was happening, to their doom by these evil women. The vamp, who was a kind of a prominent figure in American film iconography in the 20s, had disappeared. There were not very many of those Europeanized vampish creatures in American films of the 30s, or even of the war years during the 40s. But for some reason, they came out like a rash during the late years of the war and the beginning of the peacetime decade. Very often, they were the lovers of former soldiers who were in some sense damaged by their war experience. Anyway, they are, to me, problematical figures, and it is problematical to me why the American public at that time seemed to go for these, and I'm talking literally now, dozens and perhaps hundreds of films that are not different from this film, except that this film is, I think, infinitely better made. But the peculiar question of why the relationship between the male, who was rather passive, and the female, who was rather active, became such a central romantic drama in American films is something that I only speculate on, and maybe after the film we can all speculate on it together. But it is very curious matter, this, and it passed, like any fever dream. It passed off, and everybody was well and happy, and Doris Day was amongst us. But for this moment, these sort of creatures of the type that Jane Greer portrays in this movie were very much to the fore, and the kind of males that Robert Mitchum played were very prominent in our romantic iconography. That seems to me a sufficiency of introduction. This is not a movie to be talked to death, and it's not a movie to be taken all that seriously. I really do think it's a very entertaining piece of romantic realism. I've chosen it, as I say, because I like it a lot, and I like it a lot whether it's on at 2 in the morning in television or over at the Regency or just thinking about it. And I hope in that spirit you will enjoy it. It was at the time merely another in the steady drone of studio releases coming out at that time. No one particularly paid any attention to it critically. Whether or not it made money, I couldn't possibly tell you. I don't think it lost any money to speak of. But it was just another movie of 1947. And it is only in recent years, as scholars and film buffs have taken to studying and maybe over-studying film noir, that it is beginning to achieve its public. I think you'll see why almost immediately. Thank you. If there are any questions or comments or discussion, I'd be glad to, if I can see you, deal with it.
Why did the young man, I didn't understand at the end, she asked him if he was going away with her, why did he say yes?
Oh, so she would spend the rest of they are the same genre. Obviously, one of the things that happens in Maltese Falcon is that Sam Spade catches on to the machinations of the sort of spider woman, and is able, as Mitchum is unable to do, send her over, to use his line. I think in some ways the sort of the one-liner or the brief gag exchanges in Maltese Falcon are superior to this. I mean, sort of a livelier film in that way. I didn't really mean to compare the two pictures, except to say that the Maltese Falcon is really kind of the noir film. I mean, because it was such an enormously popular film, that cut of life and that style of filmmaking from that point onward entered into the mainstream of American filmmaking. I don't think the two pictures are in tonality, other than certain visual styles, at all alike. I think this is a more romantic picture and a much darker picture. I think it's important to notice that these pictures do come out of the gangster genre of the 30s. I mean, there's no question about that. It's just that in these pictures, we don't see the rise usually of the protagonist. I mean, those pictures tended to be about criminals coming to the top. In pictures like From the Maltese Falcon onward, sort of the mob is a given, as it is in the Kirk Douglas character here, and we tend to see the pictures from a different point of view. That is, from the people who are kind of innocently or partially innocently entrapped in the toils of an ongoing criminal situation. That's not previously was not true of gangster pictures. They tended to be, in fact, about the very rise of the criminal element, the shame of the nation and all that sort of stuff. By this time, I think, it does betoken a changed sort of sensibility in that we simply accept that there are guys like Kirk Douglas around and that people like Mitchum can get caught in their toils. So I think that is a substantial difference in attitude toward criminal life that's true of all of these pictures. Was there? Yeah. Awful. I think we ought to apologize a little bit. The picture is a much better looking picture than this, actually. I think either the print was printed, a couple of shades too dark, or the projection was not strong enough to really give you a good image. Also, the soundtrack was a little hard to pick up in some of its. Well, I don't know what her initial involvement was with this group of characters. I mean, she was just somehow well, no, I mean, she was obviously part of his Kirk Douglas's criminal empire. I mean, she was, and obviously Eels, the lawyer, was as well. I mean, he was his mouthpiece, his tax lawyer. And I guess that my only guess is that she was subverted by the Kirk Douglas character in order, when he saw that Eels was about to blackmail him, in order to have her steal the papers for him. I mean, all of that is always rather tenuous, I think, in most pictures of this kind. I mean, it's a wonderfully intricate plot. I like its intricacy, and I like sometimes when you have a plot that intricate, sort of stylistics go out the window because it's so much busy work to explain the plot. And I think one of the nice things about this picture is that it maintains its style, and they continue to write the line of that Mitchum character very well. I mean, he's still funny, he's still tough, he's still romantic in a certain sense, and is still caught up in his own personal drama, as it were, even though this enormously complicated plot is spinning almost out of control around him. Yeah.
One question on the plot. Mitchum was going to return 200,000 papers in exchange for an affidavit
Right.
But another affidavit could always subsequently produce.
Well, sure. I mean, you know, I mean, it is the MacGuffin. I mean, it's not important. I mean, whether or not there is an affidavit or not. I mean, the fact of the matter is that I think what's important to recognize about this, I think I kind of mentioned at the beginning, the movement of this kind of a film is always to the entrapment of the male. I mean, it really, that's its real business, sort of the details of how it gets him into the final extreme situation is really as unimportant as, you know, the MacGuffin in a Hitchcock plot. I mean, why are they all running around? It doesn't make any difference if the plans of the fort or whatever will do. The point is a more powerful emotional point, which is that the male cannot, once the web has started to be woven by the Spider Woman, he will most of the time not get out of it in a film noir. Sometimes he does, but he is usually a much sadder and much wiser fellow by the time he does. So I don't think that it's too important to get caught up in this, you know, in the whys and whethers of it. I mean, almost all the crime movies we've ever seen would be cut off in about reel 2 if somebody just simply pick up the phone and call cops, you know. Oh yeah, she and Mitchum made another picture right after this one. It was a kind of an amusing picture by Don Siegel, but I've forgotten the name of it. But she was an RKO contract player, and she plays in the sequel to this. She plays an older woman in the remake of this picture that came out last year, Against All Odds. I mean, it's not the leading role. But I don't think she's been active for the last 15 or so years. Anything else? Yeah.
One thing interesting about this as compared to other noirs is that it's basically an urban genre. In this case, the corruption although it originates in the city,
Yeah.
but out into the country, which is the land of where peace and goodness abide, a good couple, because the outdoors, where Mitchum tries to go back to the tide, yet it comes chasing after him, and that isn't seen too often in noir movies. You can see sunshine, nevertheless.
Yeah, it is sometimes true that at least some sequences of them, I mean, it will be set up as as a sort of an ideal or a dream or something someone once passed through and they would like to get back to at another time, something of that kind. I don't know if you think about something like High Sierra. I mean, the whole point of it is that, you know, they go to these beautiful mountains and there the guy is gunned down. I think you're right. I mean, and I like that element in this. I like the sort of realism of it. I mean, they obviously went to this little town in California and shot exteriors, and but it is a good point. It tends to be a cityscape in which most of these pictures are set. They did work in some nice neon and stuff here. I mean, Mexico also features in a lot of these pictures, you will notice. I don't know what that is, except that in the immediate post-war years, I think a lot of West Coast people in particular began to explore the pleasures of Mexico, and they started to make movies down there. I think also it was cheaper to shoot down there because you could use a crew that was less expensive than a Hollywood crew, possibly. But anyway, the fact is a lot of these pictures do end up, peculiarly enough, in Mexico. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.